in different units. We'd also like to say a warm word of welcome to Dr. VM Nkuna, who is from the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, who is also presenting a paper in the first session. Also in the first session, a warm word of welcome to Dr. Evgeny Kratikov, who is the principal researcher for this, at the Center for Applied Analysis for Global Transformation. And then the final speaker, a warm word of welcome in the first session, is Dr. P. Mtembu, who is representing the Institute for Global Dialogue. And for both our sessions today, and we have discussants, both from the Department of Cultural and Political Studies at the University of Limpopo. So warm word of welcome to Dr. Kogara and also Prof. C. Twala. And then I'd like to move on to say welcome to the speakers in the second session. Firstly, we have Dr. Maxim Nikolin, who is the Research Fellow for the Center for Applied Analysis of Global Transformation, and also followed by Mizret Ramik, a Research Fellow, Center for Applied Analysis of Global Transformation. And welcome to the two of you from the center. Then from Gimo University, a warm word of welcome to Maya Nikolskaya, who is a junior researcher at the Center for Middle East and African Studies, Institute for International Studies. Then the next speaker in the second session is Associate Professor Svetlana Bokeria, who is from the Department of Theory and History of International Relations, Rudan University. That's our partner university. A warm word of welcome to you. And then the final speaker is Prof. S. Ndlovu from the University of South Africa in South Africa. Warm word of welcome to Prof. S. Ndlovu. I'd also like to take this opportunity to say a warm word of welcome to our large audience who are seated at a venue at the University of Limpopo. Thank you so much for joining the event. And we did start a bit late. Unfortunately, weather conditions caused a ripple effect. However, we have started now, and we just like to say we're looking forward to a lovely day of discussions and presentations by our various speakers. And we are very grateful to be co-hosting this international conference together with Rudan University in Russia, who are our partners for this. And we're hoping to have a wonderful program where we discuss Russia-Africa relations in a uni-multipolar world. So thank you everyone for this opportunity. We welcome you to the university, and we also would like to say to you, enjoy the conference. Moreover, we would love to extend our conversations beyond the conference with all our partners, together with the audience as well. Thank you everyone, and have a lovely day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Singh, the DVC for Research, Innovation and Partnerships at University of Limpopo. Can I also maybe call Dr. Vitaly Danilov, who's the director at the Center for Applied Analysis of Global Transformation, also to do, the welcoming of guests. Doctor.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed delegates and honored guests, first of all, I would like to pay your attention and inform that this conference is held exclusively by the Center of Applied Analysis of International Transformation of Patrice Lumumba People's Friendship University and your university, University of Limpopo, and with information support of Business Magazine, .Apora, and G3. This is what I say for the beginning, but after some words about our conference, it is with great pleasure I welcome you to the Russian-Africa Relation in Uni-Multilateral Board Conference, where we gather to explore the multifaceted relationship between Russia and the African continent from a geopolitical perspective. As we convene today, we start a pivotal moment in history, characterized by evolving geopolitical dynamics and shifting global landscape. Against this backdrop, the partnership between Russia and Africa holds immense significance, representing a convergence of interests, opportunities, and shared aspirations for mutual prosperity and development. Both of us planes of the African continent to the vast expanses of the Russian Federation, our nations are bound together by history of collaboration, solidarity, and friendship. Today we come together to affirm our commitment to deepen this partnership, forging new pathway of cooperation and unlocking the boundless potential that lies within our collective endeavors. From economic cooperation and energy security to diplomatic engagement and cultural change, the Russia-Africa relationship spans a broad spectrum of domains, each contributing to the advancement of our common goals. Through strategic investments, infrastructure development, and technological innovation, we seek to harness the immense resources and opportunities that Africa has to offer, while also contributing to the continent's sustainable development and inclusive growth. Moreover, from a geopolitical perspective, the partnership between Russia and Africa is characterized by a shared vision of a multipolar world order based on principles of sovereignty, equality, and mutual respect. As we navigate the complexities, the global geopolitical landscape, our collaboration serves as a beacon of stability, cooperation, and solidarity, fostering peace, security, and prosperity for our respective regions and beyond. As we embark on this journey of exploration and dialogue, let us seize opportunity to deepen our understanding, strengthen our bonds, and chart of course towards a future of shared prosperity and cooperation. Together, let us forge a new chapter of the Russian-Africa partnership, grounded in the principle of friendship, trust, and mutual benefit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vitali. Also, colleagues, as I did mention that our department is hosting this international conference in collaboration with RUDN University. Can I also maybe call the message of support? Can we receive the message of support from Prof. Nicolay, who's the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, RUDN University. Prof.
Apologies, colleagues. I think Professor Nikolai Yagodka was not able to join us. He had an emergency meeting, but also because the time. So he's not with us. Apologies.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sorry, because of technical problems, it's quite too late for him. Sorry.
All right, noted. Thank you very much, colleagues. I think now we can, start with session 2 of our program, which will be the presentation of papers. And of course, there'll be quite a number of changes. For instance, Prof. Vladimir won't be able to join us for this session. And also, we are going to have Dr. VM Nkuna, who's going to present the first paper. Dr. VM Nkuna is attached to Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, and he will be presenting on Russia's increased presence in Africa since the Ukraine crisis. Can we give him a round of applause? Dr. Nkuna, you may start with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luvodi. Greetings to our capable and valued students, University of Limpopo Department of Cultural and Political Studies staff members, Deputy Vice Chancellor Jessica Sin, Professor Hutatso Shai, and um, colleagues from the university in Russia, all protocol observed.
Dr.
Good
Nkuna,
morning, colleagues. My
Dr.
name is
Nkuna.
Bongani Mushurunguna. I'm affiliated with Thabo Mbeki, African School of Public and International Affairs, as a postdoctoral research fellow. So I'm here today to present a paper on Russia's presence in Africa since the Ukraine war. Let me start by saying,
Dr. Nkuna,
yes,
please, can you maybe just allow us to see you? Kindly activate your video. Please share your screen if it's possible. Thank you.
yeah, can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. As I was saying, I'm presenting on Russia's increased presence in Africa since the Ukraine war. The background of the study is based on Russia's compiled interest in Africa since the invasion in Ukraine. If we remember quite well, in February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it stimulated debates from the West, mainly the US and the European Union members. And then that resulted in sanctions that were imposed to Russia, especially crippling economic sanctions. So this made Russia to search for alternative partners. And then in this instance, Africa became a conducive or an opportune partner for Russia. So this can be understood within the backdrop of the 2019 Russia-Africa Summit, which was hosted in Sochi, Black Sea, where Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, invited a delegation of African leaders to discuss the security, economic, and political affairs of Africa and Russia's political cooperation. Almost from the invited 54 members of the African Union, 47 attended. And then again, if we check and compare it with the 2023, last year, Russia-Africa Summit, only 17 African leaders attended. So this must be understood with the background of the United States or the West pressure in pressurizing African states to cooperate with Russia since the Ukraine war started. Also, the study also hints on the polarization of international relations, which revokes or invokes the politics that we have witnessed during the Cold War. So in this new emerging multilateralism global politics, we see a polarized global order which consists of what I can say, politics of solidarity. Those who advocate for the West and those who stand with Russia. So in this instance, we can use the Ukraine war as a case in point to argue the division within the United Nations Security Council and the General Assembly. So when we read back on where Vladimir Putin was charged with war crimes by the International Criminal Court, it raised contending views from both the West and the states from the global South. Amongst other things, South Africa was hosting the BRICS summit last year. And then amongst other things that South Africa needed to do, they had to arrest Vladimir Putin if he attended the BRICS summit. And then South Africa is a BRICS associate with Russia, which consists of China, Brazil, and South Africa, and India, I mean. So what this study seeks to achieve, or what seeks to discuss, is Russia's increased presence in Africa since the Ukraine war, on the back view of trying to survive sanctions, again, playing the politics of solidarity with African states. So the highlight of the Russia-Africa summit, which was hosted last year, it was the emergence of Ibrahim Traore, publicly welcoming Russia as a family to his governance. And then this was done after military coups in the Sahel region were frequented, with Russia's support through their private military companies, also known as PMCs, and then its name Wagner. If you can remember, Wagner nearly destroyed the intentions of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, and then later it was nationalized, and then it became a state company. And then recently, Wagner, it works for Russia in terms of securing security cooperations, especially in the Sahel region. And then recently, we can look at the security cooperation between Russia and Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, in Libya, and in CAR, Central African Republic. So, what's the key drivers of Russia's PMCs to be heavily involved in supplying arms to these militant governments? So there are contrasting views on this instance. Some argue that since Russia is under crippling sanctions which were imposed by the West, security cooperations are signed which make Russia to access minerals in terms of gold for them to survive the sanctions that are imposed to them. And then others argue that since Russia is amongst or only the European superpower that didn't participate in the transatlantic slave trade, and then the imperial colonization, which was institutionalized as the scramble for Africa. So the politics of solidarity emerge even in this case in point, that many African states or African leaders see Russia as an honorary global South state, which has the same commitments and interest for anti-imperial agenda that is imposed by the United States and the European Union, especially in the Sahel region, imposed by French. So for the interest of time and exhausting other presenters' time, let me stop here, and then those who wish to engage me will do it with a Q&A. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nkuna. Can we give him a round of applause? Quickly, I'm going to now call Dr. Nyere from the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation to present on Africa-Russia relations revisited. Doc, over to you.
Thank you so much, Program Director. I rise on the established protocol And I just want to extend a word of gratitude to the organizers of this very timely conference. Now, my presentation, I have titled it Africa-Russia Relations Revisited, and I'm offering a decolonial perspective or a decolonial reading into this issue. So my paper, firstly, it aims to interrogate, amongst other facets, the political, the economic, and the military relations between the government of Russia and the African Union. And you will realize why I speak particularly about the African Union and not necessarily the different states in Africa. So the idea is to highlight the controversies and some limitations of the Afro-Russo partnerships and the implications of the particular common partnership, which is the Russia-Africa Partnership Forum. So I aim to analyze the nature and the significance of this new strategic partnership between African states and Russia itself. Now, I just want to highlight what has prompted my study. So I want to piggyback on what Dr. Nkuna has already spoken about. So the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, it has upset a number of interstate relations across the world. And it has affected trade and commerce, amongst other things. It has affected political relations, diplomatic relations, and military relations between states. But particularly the Russia-Africa Partnership Forum, it is of interest to my study because that particular forum is governed and coordinated through a memorandum of understanding between the government of Russia and the African Union. Now, I just want to jump and sketch the historical antecedents of global international history. I think historicization will help us understand and appreciate the intensity of the issue we are dealing with. So in 1648, and I know political science students, when it comes to historicization, we are very good at that, but there is a point I want to make with this historicization. I will highlight three particular dates. So 1648, we all know it's associated with the official codification of the doctrine of state sovereignty, wherein in that doctrine, it was recognized that all states are equal. So irrespective of stature or economic size or military might or geographic space, all states are equal. And they carry that equality because beyond the authority of the state, there is no other. So that's where the sovereignty phrase comes from, right? So we know in 1648, every country or every state has sovereignty and therefore there is no other authority beyond it. But what happened in 1884, 1885, we all know, and Dr. Nkuna spoke about this, the Berlin West Africa Conference, what we have commonly known as the partitioning of Africa. And the partitioning of Africa was according to European whims and European imagination. So this is what the Europeans, who incidentally had started with the doctrine of state sovereignty to say all states are equal, but when they come to Africa, it's almost like that doctrine is suspended. In fact, I argue that the doctrine of state sovereignty had no Africa in mind. So this is where the problem is. The Berlin West Africa Conference only partitioned Africa according to European whims. Now, 1945 came, and I know I'm skipping a lot of important dates here, but 1945 came and we sit with what we now have as the United Nations international system, right? And the international system that is undergirded by the UN forcibly incorporated Africa into the capitalist system. And the capitalist system is undergirded by the Bretton Woods institutions, such as the IMF, the World Bank Group, the World Trade Organization, among others. So this is the problem that we sit with in terms of the history of international relations. Now, Russia has stood with African states or with African countries through their struggle for independence, through their struggle for emancipation and their struggle for freedom. For instance, I will just mention two states out of interest of time. Zimbabwe, where I come from, Zimbabwe received so much support from the Russian Federation at that time, and they received not only ideological support, they also received financial support, they also received military support. And this support was rendered to African nationalists. So the political formations in Zimbabwe, some of the prominent leaders today in Zimbabwe were trained under the socialist movement, and they were trained in Russia. So Russia has stood with African countries. So too, in terms of Angola, Angola shares a similar history to that of Zimbabwe, of colonization, of being conquered, and also waging a struggle for independence in that country. So we know for a fact Russia stood with Angola, and it also supported Angola ideologically, it supported Angola financially and militarily. So the military training is undoubted. So there is a soft spot, I would argue, for Russia when it comes to African states. Besides, Russia has no colonial history in Africa. We cannot link Russia to any imperial agenda in Africa. In fact, I argue Russia has been on the side of Africans, African nationals, when they were trying to dislodge the colonial matrices that were embedded by colonialism. Now, this already speaks about the decolonial framework that I use to analyze. So I choose decoloniality because I aim to disentangle our histories from coloniality of knowledge, right? Coloniality of knowledge and information. Much of the information and much of the knowledge that is purported to be canon, which really comes from the European geography of reason, is biased. And we know we cannot trust that kind of canon because it endorses Eurocentrism. And we know for a fact during the Cold War, the main conflict was between the USSR at that time and the USA, the capitalist USA. And so there is no way that in terms of proffering knowledge and information, that the USA and its allies would be fair and would be frank when it comes to reporting on Russia. Therefore, we sit with reportage that is skewed. So I aim to use decoloniality to debunk that mystery. I will not go into the methodology so that we save on time, but I just want to underscore that in terms of analyzing Africa-Russia relations, I do so from an Afrocentric approach, and it privileges and centers African perspectives and African voices into the Afro-Russo relations. And this is deliberate because we also have to look out for ourselves as Africans as we engage with Russia. Now, Russia has unmatched advantage over African countries. Now, this brings us to the main point of contention. Russia is a unitary or a singular state, and it operates as a unit when it comes to international trade, to its foreign policy and international relations and engagements. Therefore, it is relatively easy to follow and assess Russia's trajectory when it comes to international relations because it operates from a central position in Moscow, right? So Russia can afford to pick and choose African states that it wants to trade with or to engage with. So for instance, we know for a fact Russia has signed military cooperation agreements with 21 African governments, right? It's 21 African governments that were handpicked by Russia. And there is nothing wrong with that. The only issue is that it's Russia that has to initiate this. Now, 55 African states, of course, 54 are only recognized, and vis-a-vis 21 African states, clearly you can see that Russia has an unfair advantage when it comes to relations that it has with Africa. On the other hand, Africa cannot do so. It is impeded on many levels. So on one level, South Africa sometimes is very difficult to come up with a position to take a stand, owing to bureaucratic processes, but also the issue of convening 55 or 54 heads of states to agree on one thing. And this is our weakness. So the continent of Africa is then cast as a receiver of what Russia has to offer, and not vice versa. And that is problematic, and this is what we want to highlight, to say things should be changed. This is why it is necessary to re-look and reassess what it is. Dr. Nkuna has already spoken about the Russia-Africa Summit, which was first held in 2019, and the one that was held in 2023 last year. We realized that all these were initiatives, particularly by Russia, and no African agency could really be put there. And that is problematic. Now, the issue is Africa's fragmentation, which resulted from European colonization, continue to militate against Africa's international relations. And my perception is that Russia has taken advantage of this. Of course, the fragmentation is not of Russian manufacturing or of Russian origin, but it has advantaged other players, not only Russia, other global players when it comes to African states, because we are fragmented and we cannot negotiate and unionize and come to make deals that advantage Africa as one. Now, I know there is a temptation to say, but with Russia, it has partnered with the African Union. I am sorry to argue that the African Union does not represent the people of Africa. And I say this because if you look at the constituent members of the African Union, it is not people of Africa, it is states. And these very states are problematic because they are modeled on the European state, European concept of state, which came with these artificial borders that were imposed. So it is problematic in that way. Now, a way forward. Let's look at economies of scale. And I know this measurement in terms of looking at the economy or the economic might and sizes of countries, the gross domestic produce, GDP, in spite of its limitations and problems, I think we can use that as an indicator to help us understand the nature of the asymmetry we are dealing with. So Russia's GDP, according to the World Bank, stands at 1.7 trillion US dollars, right? It's pegged in US dollars. It's no surprise because the Bretton Woods institutions still control the aspect of economics worldwide. So it's 1.7 trillion dollars. And Africa, on the other hand, combined GDP of Africa is 2.7 trillion dollars. Now, clearly, when Russia negotiates with independent African countries or individual African countries, there is no way that the negotiations would be fair. There is no way that the negotiations would be symmetrical, because Russia would then exert undue economic pressure on any single African country. However, if African countries were to unify and unionize, they had to amalgamate. It will be a bone to contend with, because we sit with $2.3 trillion GDP. Now, I had to sketch that out so that we try to realize that clarion call that sits with the AU. The AU has a mandate. Its mandate is clear, to unite Africa, but we still dilly-dally and we still have all these regional economic blocks that are not helping us to unify. I just want to bring to your attention a some financial architecture that was developed by the late president, former president of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. He attempted to institutionalize an African currency. And my reading is that this is the only way to go. The African currency would then compel us to work together in terms of our trade. And it does away with unnecessary duty and unnecessary bureaucracies in terms of changing these currencies on the market. It does away with that. So what we should be doing as Africans, especially in relation to global players such as Russia, is to negotiate business deals as a collective African continent. The AU has failed in its current form. I do not think the AU is capable of realizing those aspirations, because half the time that union, the AU, has become almost an old boys club where these African presidents endorse each other and they do not hold each other to account. And there is no room for citizenry to participate in the African Union because the constituent members remain states. So it is clear, though, that economies of scale will play a significant part in realizing and determining whether the world will engage with Africa. So if they will not engage with Africa for any other reason, if we unionized and we had to bring to the table $2.3 trillion economy, they will respect us because they respect power, they respect money. I want to end here for now. I thank you for your attention. I will be in here to share my details in case there are people who would want to engage with me further. Thank you so much, Program Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nyere. Can we please also give him a round of applause? Without wasting any time, I'm going to invite Prof. Evenji Krashikov, who's the principal researcher at the Center for Applied Analysis of Global Transformation. Prof will be presenting on Russia as a structural actor in international system. Prof?
Thank you. Dear colleagues, in the 21st century, Russia acts as the main political force among those who form international structure, alternative to the Western ones. It presents itself as a representative of the huge developing world taking shape in international practice and conceptualized in international theory as a collective non-West. Russia's national interest has become especially relevant for the world politics in connection with Russia's special military operation, which brought Russia into the epicenter of international politics and ultimately established it as the third pole of international relations, bringing to an end the era of unipolar world order and thus shaping a tripolar structure of world politics. I mean United States of America, China, and the Russia Federation. The joint statement of Russia and China on international relations in the new era made by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping in Beijing on February 4, 2022, 20 days before starting the special military operation, in fact, secures the military political alliance or alliance without signing a treaty between the two countries, confirmed the participation for the first time of three types of armed forces, land, naval, and air forces in the international exercise Vostok 2022, as well as the establishment of competing norms in the practice of international relations. In no small measure, it was Russia's special military operation provoked by the aggressive actions of the United States in Ukraine, aimed at expanding the NATO military infrastructure to Russian borders. The core of international structure being created, such as BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organizations, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, are Russia and China. Therefore, let us consider the strategic partnership of the two countries, in which main thing is strategic trust between two countries. China-Russia strategic trust. Despite the existence of different points of view regarding the dynamics of Russia-China relations, Russia remains China's main and only global strategic partner. The interaction is characterized not only by an increase in bilateral trade. For example, in 2020, it was $106 billion. 2021 year, $146.9 billion, and in 2022, $109.3 billion, and last year it was $240 billion in our trade relations, but also to a certain extent by the growing importance of Russia as a factor in China's national security. For example, assistance in creating an early warning system against missiles attack, supplies of S-300 and S-400 air defense systems, our military aircraft Su-35 aircraft of the 4++ generation, joint patrols of Russia Tu-85 strategic missile carriers with the Chinese Air Force in the adjacent seas, regular large-scale joint military maneuvers, etc. So Russia's military operation has demonstrated the strength of such variables in international relations as strategic trust and strategic interdependence. Both countries have come a long way to establish stable and reliable relations, and the level of these relations enables them to exert significant influence on international policy. The progressive dynamics of Russia-China rapprochement results from the increasing pressure of the international system on both countries, I mean Russia and China, especially after the incorporation of Crimea and Sevastopol city into Russia in 2014, the start of the US trade and sanctions war against People's Republic in China in 2018, and the accession of 4 regions to Russia in 2022. In turn, the unwillingness to create a formal alliance is due to obstacles related to the imperatives of the domestic economy and historical memory. During Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow on March 2023, the parties adopted 2 joint statements of great importance for bilateral relations. First of all, on the deepening the relations of comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation between Russia and China, entering a new EPO and on the plan for the development of key areas of Russia-Chinese economic cooperation until 2030. Thus, cooperation will expand in almost all areas and strategic trust will be reinforced. Some researchers use for the current Russia-Chinese relations the term asymmetric win-win. The widely known statement about the economic complementary of Russia and China is, in fact, a constraining factor for the development of the Russian economy, contributing to the establishment of an unfavorable model of economic interaction between Russia and China. It's appropriate to say that Russia is stuck at the stage of comparative advantage of backwardness, securing for itself the role of raw material economy in its relations with China. And the result of bilateral trade for 2022 show that the growth of trade volumes was due to the increase in surplus of Russia oil, gas and coal in China. Economic interdependent states, as a rule, consider the treat concerning an economic partner primarily in the sphere of material interests, which nevertheless in 2022 receded into the background and are now considered by Russia mainly in the context of geopolitical acquisitions. An increase in the territory due to the inclusion of the Donetsk People's Republic, Lugansk People's Republic, Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. Population about 8 million people, opportunities for the agriculture products, about 10 million tons of exported grain. All encompassing sanctions imposed on Russia became a reason for similar or even tougher sanctions that could be imposed on Beijing, People's Republic of China, if it decided to restore its sovereignty over Taiwan. Balancing the structure of production, trade, finance, inbound and outbound investment to minimize the losses and costs for the sanctions party becomes an important strategic issue for Beijing. It's my conclusions about the situation in Russia and China. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ejni. Can we also give him a round of applause for the presentation? Colleagues, we're going to have just a slight change on our session 2. I'd like to call upon Maya Niksolskaya, who's the junior researcher at the Center for Middle East and Africa Studies, Institute for International Studies at Mgimo University. Maya will be presenting a paper titled Persistence of Memory, Rethinking Russia and Africa's Cultural Legacy. Maya, you have 15 minutes, and you may start with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear moderator. I'm really pleased to be here online with my colleagues from Rudin, but also, of course, from Limpopo University. And it is an honor and a pleasure for me to be speaking for this audience for the first time. Now, one of the reasons why I chose to talk about culture is that obviously it's one of the frequently overlooked subjects and one of the overlooked dimensions when it comes to analyzing international relations. And most mainstream theories, if we can put it that way, such as the realism theory and the liberalism theory, actually struggle to find the right place as to what place culture should occupy in the analysis of international politics, international relations, and at best, especially if we look at Marxist interpretations, at best it will be presented as something secondary to politics and economy. Now, we should probably turn to what we call middle way theories, such as constructivism, critical theory, and the English school of thought, which posit that obviously culture plays a major role as to how states conduct their affairs on an international stage, what kinds of norms and practices, which are also cultural traditions and cultural practices that shape their behavior, and how they influence the kinds of interactions that states have between themselves in the international arena. Now, when it comes to national identity and identity in general, I'm absolutely convinced that in this world where we are struggling to find the right balance, it seems, between globalization on the one hand and fragmentation on the other, we see an increasing need for finding an identity of our own. So this applies first and foremost to my country, because, you know, Russia, even though it dates back, it traces its roots to many, many centuries ago, it still is at the same time a young country, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, disintegrated, Russia started to build a national identity of its own, and it had to find new purpose, new meanings, and obviously all of that was very deeply reflected in the culture. And still many things that we have today are shaped by the kind of cultural consciousness that we have. But also this is the issue that should ring the bell for Africa, because many African countries are also young, even though they also have a long history that goes back centuries, because of the pre-colonial kingdoms and pre-colonial civilizations that used to be there. And obviously after decolonization and after even following a lengthy period of perhaps disenchantment with what the current international order had to offer, many African countries are also looking for meanings, for things that might define them in their own continent, but also in the global international arena, as we see things like, for instance, the 6 African countries coming up with a peace plan for Russia and Ukraine, which means that obviously those countries are interested in redefining the place of Africa and the values of how Africa views itself in this modern world. Now I would like to draw your attention to some of the issues that I strongly believe that might not be immediately apparent, but they're actually similar, that Russia and Africa are experiencing now in terms of a cultural phenomenon. And I'm talking in particular about the parallels between cancel culture for Russia on the one hand and what we call colorblind casting for Africans on the other hand. Now, both of these phenomena were generated, they initially started in the Western world, in the so-called global North. And as we all know, cancel culture is something that Russia experienced after February 2022, after the Ukrainian conflict broke out. So some of its manifestations included not only Western companies leaving the market, as we all know, and general castigation and criticisms of Russia in the international arena, but we also saw things like sporting rules being rewritten, when we saw our athletes being excluded from major sporting events, when we saw certain platforms like Netflix suspending their services to Russian clients, even, you know, like ordinary citizens, civilians that have absolutely nothing to do with the conflict. And then one very big thing that we are witnessing increasingly is Russia's high culture being cancelled and Russia's high culture being excluded. You know, if you look at the differences between Russia's cultural diplomacy and American cultural diplomacy, you will see that the big difference is that America tries, for instance, and I'm taking the US as an example because it's one of the best researched, one of the best studied ones. So for America, what it promotes, it uses its pop culture in order to promote its own values, its own ideas, and its own lifestyle. And Russia, on the other hand, has been always promoting its high culture. This is, I'm talking about its theater, its drama, its cinema, its ballet, mostly. So things that, some of its museums and expositions, so things that are not always part of the high culture, so that are not part of the pop culture. So because those things are not immediately available for everyone, and because there is a selection of Russian artists that has been present on the international scene, Russian culture became an easy target for canceling, or cancel culture. As the Russian president put it very wisely, I think, at this point, cancel culture has become the phenomenon of canceling culture itself in the first place. That means that culture is no longer treated as an integral phenomenon. So when you try to splinter one part of it away, this is what you get. You get culture that is not actually culture, if you come to think of it. And we see that it is being used, this cancel culture is being used as a very powerful weapon in international relations to build a certain image of Russians that is actually a far cry from what many Russians actually are in the first place. So a culture is being installed, an ethics where being Russian is something shameful, where people say you should be ashamed because of your passport, because of your nationality. So this creates, a world, like whenever you manifest yourself as Russian, this is something that is again widely criticized in the Western world. Some other things that are directly related to culture, art and culture, is in many Western countries, for instance, they imposed, I'm talking about Europe and the United States, of course, mostly. So there has been censorship on Russia's 19th century writers. So those people who have nothing to do with the present international situation, they were completely removed from the school curriculum and the university's curriculum. So in many ways, in many instances, that literature is no longer even studied, and it is not available to students. It also involved renaming some of the Russian cultural objects and deleting the so-called Russian trace by changing the nationality of their creators. So, for instance, whenever someone was considered a Russian writer or a Russian sculptor, they were, the producers, the people who make decisions that would officially change that nationality to someone who is Ukrainian or someone who is Belarusian, but they would never say that those people who contributed something to world's cultural legacy have anything to do with Russia. So, and of course, there have been detentions of Russian collections, art collections. For instance, there was one notorious when there was a collection coming back to Russian National Museum that was stuck on the Finnish-Russian border because of this cancel culture. And the other side, on the side of Finland, they were trying to prove that because of this cancel culture, Russia no longer has the right to retrieve its own collection, its own art collection. So this is something that is very similar to what has been happening in Africa, if you come to think of it, with all the restitution process. Because when Western governments claim that they want to keep, especially the United Kingdom has been very adamant in that they say we want to keep African, we want to keep African objects, African art objects and items in our museums because it's part of world heritage. This is not your heritage. So again, this is a case for a prime case of discrimination. And then for Africa, what we see on the other hand is something that is widely called blind casting, color blind casting. And of course, it proceeds from the social movement that in the United States that was dubbed Black Lives Matter. But as it very often happens, we see in the international arena that something that starts out as a good thing always ends up, very often at least, ends up being misused and abused. So we see an increasing number of black actors African actors being cast in roles that are supposed to be filled up by white people, because those are historical films. So, for instance, you have this widely known movie on Netflix about Anne Boleyn, who was the English wife of King Henry. And you know that in the end, so she's played by an African actress. So in the end, what happens? She's executed. She and all of her family, they are played by African actors. So it looks like, and those characters are sent to exile. So if you don't know the story, if you don't know the backstory, it looks as if there was discrimination coming from this King Henry, who was trying to, murder the whole wonderful African family that was living in the UK back in the day, which is complete nonsense. So what we see here, because of this colorblind casting, is actually a replacement of real African history and real African characters by this kind of show that the Western cinematographers are trying to put up. And it extends to so many spheres of human life, because obviously Africans have a history of their own, and they should have characters of their own, which is also quite obvious. And for that matter, the idea of color conscious casting that has been promoted by some film studios recently sounds like a better idea, because the idea behind color conscious casting is that unless you are blind, we can actually see color, and we need to have more films about African characters, about people from African history. For instance, if now how this problem, there was this issue of how to put Russian heroes, Russian national characters, to make them part of Russian history back in the 18th century. So one of the ways it was solved is a Russian scholar and statesman, Mikhail Lomonosov. He came up with 25 subjects from Russian history, and those were like 25 standards for paintings that were supposed to be made related to historical subjects. So that was a standard that was from the 18th century. We have a certain set of historical ideas, of historical plot lines that are now part of something that is reproduced in culture. So this is something that probably we need to do in African countries as well. So we need to come up with a list of our own, of African characters, African heroes and kings that used to be there before colonial times, and even during decolonization, rather than borrow the mermaid, borrow the Snow White, and anyone else from the Western culture. And as I'm about to sum up, I would like to put this issue into a broader context of what we call politics of memory and symbolic politics. Recently we have seen in both in Russia and in Africa, we have seen an increasing interest in reviewing some of our most important historical landmarks. So in Russia, we see this from so many speeches that are made by President Putin, where he provides a lot of emotional appeals to certain historical events. And also there is an increased focus on celebration of Russian national holidays that mark major historic events, such as the 9th of May, which is victory in the Great Patriotic War, or the Second World War, which is obviously November the 4th, that is 1612, that was the liberation of Russia from Poles when Russia was under foreign occupation, etc., etc. So, and even now, in September 2023, we had a new generation of history school books that were introduced to Russia. Now we have a rethinking of our own history. And we have absolutely the same process going on in Africa right now. That's something we should pay more attention to. For example, in Liberia, there is a new trend towards looking past just colonial history towards studying things that were there before 1822 when Liberia was founded, when the slaves were freed, but also to investigate other data that is not Eurocentric, to look for less obvious for less obvious sources like the logbooks of ships that were provided by the Portuguese side, for instance. So we do not only look at our history from a Eurocentric side. So I think we do need all of those things. We need to rethink our approach to culture, not only from the standpoint of using it as a political tool in international relations, but also as a way of affirming our own identity, in terms of understanding deeply who we are, where we are moving, and how we should see our place in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maya. May we please give her a round of applause? As I did mention, colleagues, Maya was, the last speaker for our first session. Dr. Mtembu, I'm told he's in a shuttle on his way to campus, so he will be, part of the next session that we're going to have. And also, I just want to thank the 4 speakers of the first session who really, traced the evolution of Russia-Africa relations, by considering questions of identity, questions of solidarity, trade, investment, influence, and expansion in this changing geopolitical order. So without wasting any time, I'd like to invite Dr. Gugara, who is who's attached to the Department of Cultural and Political Studies, UL, will be our discussant for all the papers that were presented in the first session. Dr. Gugara.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lekhodi, for the opportunity. And I would like also to take the opportunity to thank our presenters for the wonderful presentation. I hope we are having load shedding. I hope my network will not give me a challenge on my side. Okay, I'm going to zero in firstly on the issue that Dr. Nkuna raised relating to the July 2023 Russian summit that was held in St. Petersburg. Now, if we look, the second meeting that was held there, the president of Russia invited the African leaders on his home turf. And when we look at that, the attendance, if it's something to go by, it is really interesting to see if either the president of Russia is interested in Africa or the Africans are interested in Russia. Because if we were to check the first meeting that was held in Sochi in 2019, 45 or 47 turned up. But the meeting in St. Petersburg, only 2/3 of them stayed away, meaning to say 17 out of 54 countries attended. That on its own gives a picture whether the relations are souring or the relations are on a better footing. Now, if we to look at the meetings that was held, the first aspect that the President Putin put on was promising free weapons to enhance security on the African continent. The second aspect was cooperation on trade, science, and technology. Now, having to look at the presentation or what has been put on the negotiation table. Firstly, let's consider 54 countries being invited to Russia for a meeting. There's been comments over that, this asymmetrical relationship between these two. 54 countries traveling to meet one country. Is it on a fair balance or something is not really up to standard? Then someone said Africa should be cautioned that there's no free lunch in the modern dynamic world that we are living. The second issue has been raised on Africa being, Russia being Africa's biggest arms dealer. We know they've been supplying arms. And when we look at the Western perspective, they've been coming promising human rights. And if ever you are not adhering to the human rights, then you become punished. Especially it could be regarding the issue of the LGBTQI. Even though they're advocating for human rights, they themselves are not saints. But on the other hand, they are also showing and reflecting Russia as sort of, pushing the agenda of militarization. And when we look at it, can it be said it could be a good agenda? Is it something that we have to stand by? I mean, if we are to look at that, I think we need to look at the historical issue around the relationship that the Soviet Union had with the African countries. We know that the supply of arms, especially in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Angola, and Mozambique, was actually to stop the Western influence, where they were trying to colonize and take over all African countries. Now, having looked at the historical background, like Dr. Nyere has indicated, we can see that most of all these governments that were assisted by Russia during the War of Liberation are still in power. And even some of the leaders have actually studied in Russia, with President Thabo Mbeki, President Zuma. We also have Yasson Salem Abbas from Chad. And we are still quite a number of our students who are still traveling to study there in Russia. So the relationship still shows something is going on. And when we look at the historical perspective, indeed, South Africa was supplied with money, training, and weapons to fight the apartheid. And it also shows that African countries have not forgotten this narrative. No wonder they still stand and support Russia. Now, on the backdrop of the arms supply, when I looked at the economic side, there's been minimum assistance that really Russia has been putting on the continent. But when we look at the arms, Russia is the biggest exporter of arms in Africa. The statistics that I have looked at, which were around 2023, it showed 44% arms from Russia, 17 from US, China with 10%, France with 6%, then others with 23%. That also makes me to zero in on the issue that Dr. Nkuna raised, the Wagner group that has been termed the mercenary group that is operating especially in Mali, Central African Republic, and Sudan. And when we look at this group, it's fostering autocratic regimes, and especially in exchange for natural resources. And when we look at this group, it's really perpetrating gross human rights violations. So there's also a need for us to look into it and see the aspect. Now, trying to balance the aspect of the economy, I think we were aware when the African Union Commission chair indicated that Africa is suffering, and they were lamenting that the war between Russia and Ukraine was making Africa's food crisis worse. Now, responding to this African call to end the conflict, the response was that this was hypocritical accusations by the West using Hunger Games, which to me sounded like propaganda wars narratives. And in response to that, President Putin of Russia announced the free grain supplies to 6 African nations. That was 10 days after the blocking of the exports from Ukraine by quitting the Black Sea grain deal. So indeed, there's a need to have a very critical look into it. Whilst I'm still in the ambit of time, I'm going to end with this critical part, which is going to be food for thought and none for the stomach. I've also noted the influence of how Russia has started influencing, especially in the Central African Republic, the emergence of the Russian Orthodox Republic. We have noted that now the Roman Catholic Church has more like been replaced, has been gone out, and the Russian Orthodox Church has come in. And as Africans, I think we know the influence of the church. We're in the era of the Papa movement. we're not also sure now with the influence that Russia is coming in line of the church. What are we expecting, especially on the indoctrination part, how our African brothers are easily brainwashed, especially because of the name of religion. And I don't know if it's also going to open up avenues for more seminarians going to Moscow to study for, for training, for religious studies and all that. Key to that in the Central African Republic is also the coming in of the Russian private army that is providing protection to the president. It's something that also needs to be noted and taken into our perspective. We are seeing the protection coming to the president, we are seeing the church coming in. When I looked at some of the comments that some of the people who are attending some of these churches in Central African Republic, they were a bit happy, indicating that they are with a great partner that is providing security for them. But I could also see some of the comments, some commentators were afraid to comment on that. Lastly, the issue of the BRICS plus other countries, I think it's quite notable, and we need to applaud it, because we've also seen how more African countries are coming in to join. So all in all, we begin to see that, there is indeed a good relationship that is there, but also there are other things that need to be questioned, that we need to examine, so that our relationship as Africa and Russia should be on a good footing and should lead to sustainable development, should lead to protection of natural resources. If ever they are to be extracted, it should be done in a manner that is persistent and consistent to our international law, to our laws, and in protection of our indigenous communities. I think on that note, I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kugara. Let's give him a round of applause. I see people online are already doing that. Thank you very much for really making us understand, the papers better. We are now on the last section of the first session, which is the Q&A. Colleagues, I'm going to now take hands if you have any questions regarding the papers that were presented. With a show of hands, I'm going to start with those in the venue, and then if colleagues are having any questions also online, I'll just read them out. Can I see with a show of hand? I see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's it. Sorry. So we're only going to take those hands in that order. Please try to get straight to the question. And can we have the mic, the roaming mic? You may pose your question.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for the opportunity. Since the time is no longer on our side, let me try to be short like a miniskirt. By the way, my name is Rapta Dasfag. Chibi Strait. One of the development that Russia is doing in Africa is that one of the development that Russia is doing in Africa is that of building military base in Central African Republic and building nuclear power in Burkina Faso and Egypt. So personally myself, I think they are doing all of that to attack or maybe dethrone USA using Africa. I don't know if whether I'm right or wrong, but you will assist me, ma'am. And secondly is that most of the development state, most of the superpowers countries are, most of the superpowers countries are using Africa as a ladder to be on top. like top on top. So remember, the principle of recognition is not the simple and easier one. And if you're a state and we're not recognized, you have a big problem. So Russia, like I think Russia is developing Africa to make Africans depend on them or maybe recognize them. And with dependency, we know that scholars are saying the hand that feeds you is the hand that controls you. So what is the main aim of Russia having an interest in Africa? What is the main of Russia developing Africa so much? Because, yeah.
Thank you very much, Sefako. Second.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My name is Yokopuleng Chweni. Mine is an input button. Mine is an input directed to Maya Nikolskaya. However, first and foremost, this thing is malfunctional. Can you please assist me here, Sefako? Just make sure that this, yeah, it's a raid. Yeah, thank you very much. First and foremost, before I can proceed, we just want to welcome the 5th presidential inauguration of the most notable and most capable leader in the global arena, Mr. President Vladimir Putin. We welcome that as Africans. Thank you very much. And moreover, we are saying we are still in support. Yeah, proceeding on that, we are saying that as Africans, we are in support of the ongoing military liberation. It's not a crisis. Dr. Nkuna, we just want to correct you, it's not a crisis. It's a military liberation of Ukraine by Russia. Yeah, thank you very much. Mine is that Maya Nikolskaya, you raised an issue of the social impact that Russia has had. We're saying to my input personally is that we're living in modern times that much of the cultures and everything else, we consume it through social media, cinematography, and television and film, so that we think that Russia should put more investment and much more power and confidence in the cinematography internationally to report and produce cinematography and film of Russia from Russian culture to influence Russian culture in the global arena from the perspective and culture of Russians, not that of Hollywood, because Hollywood is very stereotypic. Thank you very much.
Greetings, my name is Anele Mthembu. My question goes as follows. One of the main tools that the West has been using to facilitate the fictional narrative and misconceptualization of Russia's interest in Africa has been mainstream media. For example, chances of tuning into the news and hearing only optimistic views about Russia and Africa's relationship are close to naught, if not. How then do we eradicate this problem and ensure that masses also get the educative info we just received about Russia's interests in Africa? Thank you.
Ma'am, did you recognize my hand? You did?
Yes.
Thank you for giving me this time. I'm Tletelo Makubele, honor student of international politics. My question is on Mr. Kuna, on the topic of Russia's increased presence in Africa since the Ukraine crisis. It is witnessed in the world that Africa have been in AGOA, the African Growth Opportunity Act with USA, with United States. Now Africa is in a relation with Russia. So my question on this is this one. Because AGOA, it has its own plans with Africa, and the Russians have its own plans with Africa. So is these plans of AGOA not threatening the plans of Russia and Africa relations because of its differences? So because of its differences, how does it leave the economic of Africa in a good standing, economic and political of Africa in a good standing? That's my question. Thank you.
I think there was a last hand up there. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Kamkhelo Alfred Maloko, and I'm very happy that I attended this session because I have learned from all of these speakers why Africa likes Russia. So, according to Dr. Nyere, it's because Russia was never a colonizer. When I think about it, I like that about Russia. So, shout out Russia. And also from Professor Grachikov, I just want to say I've noted how you have constantly referred to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine as a special military operation. And for the most part, what I've noted from your speech is that China is Russia's main cheek. And also from Dr. Nyere and Dr. Kugara, I've learned why Russia has a good relationship with Africa, but it also has an unfair relationship because Africa, most African states are still poor and divided, and the African Union, what I had, let me see. From what I heard from Dr. Nyera, what I felt like was telling me is that the African Union is a joke. And from Dr. Kugara, we've learned that Russia is actually Africa's biggest arms dealer. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing. From Dr. Maya Nikolskaya, I have learned, she mentioned how nobody in the world stage likes Russia at the moment because of what Russia has done. And I want to say that Africa has not forgotten the contributions of Russia. Okay, let me get to the point, okay? With everything that's happening in the world right now, I just want to know from all of these smart and educated people that isn't everything that's happening, especially with what's happening, I know this is not the topic of discussion, but with everything that's happening also in Palestine, isn't this breeding the atmosphere for World War III?
Okay, thank you very much, colleagues, for your question. I see we are having a comment in the chat box to say that there is an echo, so some of the speakers, I'm sure they couldn't capture the questions. I'm just going to try and paraphrase some of the questions from the room, and you'll tell me if I did not capture it right before we allow, the speakers to respond. So Sefako was talking about, his question was on Russia's interest in Africa. In some, I think this question can be answered by anybody, any of the speakers, to say, what is Russia's interest in Africa? And also the second question by Chweni was on, I don't know if a correction or, an alternative way of viewing it, to say that Dr. Nkuna perhaps must not really articulate what is happening in Russia as a crisis or invasion, but rather as, a liberation movement. Did I capture you correctly? Yes. And then the third one was by the lady this side, who said, how do we eradicate misinformation on Russia's interest in Africa? And then the other one was from Dr. Vunza, who said, how can we differentiate, between Russia's relations with Africa now and then when, especially during the Cold War, right? And another question was on AGOA plans, the US AGOA plans, to say, isn't AGOA not threatening Russia-Africa relations, or isn't Russia threatened by AGOA's plans, in its relations with Africa? And another question was on the humanitarian crisis, to say, why is Prof referring to it as, a special military intervention instead of, humanitarian crisis as we see it unfold? And then lastly was to say, with what is happening in Palestine, can we anticipate, a third world war? Colleagues, any of the speakers, we may start with, responding, or we can do it with how we presented, first with Dr. Nkuna, going down. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Program Chair. I think I have two questions, and then one is a comment. So I will start off by the question that was asked by Dr. Vunza, on the relationship or the difference between the pre-Cold War and the post-Cold War Russia's presence in Africa. So what must be understood in Africa in this instance during the Cold War is that Russia then, it was the Soviet Union, which was operating under the Marxist-Leninism ideological order, which was competing with the United States capitalist ideology or liberalism. So during the Cold War, we had a contestation of ideologies between the Soviet Union and United States of America. So it created a proxy war where, for instance, let me use South Africa as a case test. During the Anglo-Boer War, Russia fought alongside the Boers. And then as we all know, the British, they're cousins with the United States. So the British won the war, the South African War, also known as the Anglo-Boer War, in 1902. So by doing so, Russia automatically in South Africa's relations, they were sidelined for nearly a century since then. So when the Cold War started, after the World War II, Russia or the Soviet Union then could not engage with South Africa due to the, the, the conflicting ideologies that Russia adopted, and then the ideologies that, for instance, South Africa, apartheid South Africa adopted. So in this instance, Russia focused on countering capitalism governments by supporting liberation movements. So liberation movements such as the African National Congress, South African Communist Party, and in Angola were supported through military training and education to counter the capitalist government and, in this instance, apartheid. So to answer your question, Dr. Vunza, the difference between Russia's presence during the Cold War and then Russia's presence now is that during the Cold War, it was an ideological war between two global powers. So when Russia was dissolved, when the Soviet Union was dissolved, sorry, in 1992, due to the policies that was introduced by Gorbachev, I think it's Glenslot and Pestorica, which other one denotes to restructuring, and then the other one denotes to openness, which endorsed capitalist or liberalism values into Russia's economic systems. So when the Soviet Union was dissolved, in the early 1990s, again back to South Africa, the early 1990s, South Africa was undergoing a political transition, negotiations. So in this instance, South Africa could no longer receive. When I mean South Africa, I mean ANC and the liberation movement's activists. They could no longer receive assistance in terms of the Soviet Union being dissolved. So they had to engage with the apartheid government for a political settlement for a democratic dispensation government, of which succeeded. So during the 1990s, which is also labeled as the lost decade insofar as Russia's Africa relations is concerned, the then President Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, he disengaged relations with African governments, and then more than 13 embassies in Africa were closed. So when Vladimir Putin became president in 2000, one among other things that he prioritized is to re-engage with Africa. And then in 2006, he made an African tour, and then amongst other countries that he visited was South Africa, and then he signed comprehensive agreements with South Africa on energy deals. So the difference is that during Cold War, Russia was mainly fighting an ideological war with the United States, and then now Russia is regaining its strength, and then in doing so, as a former or a virtual superpower, Russia's engagement in Africa is jealously guarded by the West and the European Union as they perpetrate what we call a neo-colonialization. So in this instance, okay, let me wrap up by saying that in this instance, Russia's increased presence in Africa since the Ukraine war is to strengthen their relationship with former liberation movements in terms of cooperations that will make it survive the sanctions that are imposed by the West. So the issue of AGOA, it's a United States developmental program which consists of African states' relationship with America that allow African governments to have a market in the United States. So in this instance, Russia's South Africa relations in terms of threatening the AGOA. South Africa's AGOA market is close to $5 billion US. So by doing so, by losing this $5 billion market, South Africa will lose a lot of jobs. which currently we have a crisis of unemployment. So in doing so, South Africa on this instance, as we have seen last year during the BRICS, leading up to the BRICS summit, it was sitting on a fence with the so-called 9 alignment position in terms of condemning Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, and at the same time trying to arrest Vladimir Putin when he was supposed to visit the BRICS summit. So for the interest of time, let me stop here, and then if there are any other questions, we can take it forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mkuna. Can we have Dr. Nyere, if he's still in the session, to respond?
Thank you for the opportunity, Chair. Yes, I would like to respond to 2 particular questions. The first one has to do with what are Russia's interests in Africa? Maybe I just want to explain the nature of international relations in general. International relations are such that there is no country that can survive on its own, right? You will need to trade, you will need to engage with others for your own survival as a country. So that is a given, that is granted. However, that having been said, we also then should be looking at what is it that Russia is actually gaining from Africa. The first thing I would think that Russia wants endorsement. Russia wants the buy-in of Africa in terms of its position in the globe. So there is that need from Russia to say Africa supports it and Africa endorses it in the international arena. But we also know that Africa is the richest continent when we speak about mineral resources. However, these are depletable, right? So we should be careful then. And this is what I always argue, to say we should look out for our own interests. While we know that Russia wants resources such as raw material, such as minerals, and also labor, because Africa is the youngest continent. When we speak of population and we look at the demographics of the population, we have the youngest population, and therefore there is longevity. So all these countries, they look out for that, but Russia specifically. But what is it also that as Africans we can gain from Russia, right? Because international relations should be organic, right? And this is why I like the comment that came from the audience. This is why African leaders have sort of tolerated Russia, because when it comes to Africa-Russia engagements, Russia has only engaged Africa insofar as it has been allowed by African heads of states. So it wasn't an imposition. So we should leverage that, because that's organic international relations. What is it that we can gain from Russia? We can gain, especially when we look at the energy crisis. South Africa, Zimbabwe, there are a lot of African countries that have an energy crisis because the kind of energy that we've been using is not sustainable. Russia is options, and part of it is the nuclear energy, and that has not really been harnessed as much as it can help us. So in terms of interests, we should not only look at what Russia has an interest in on Africa, but what we also have interest in Russia. I also wanted to speak to the question about how do we eradicate misconceptions or misinformation on Russia's interests in Africa. Part of the problem is that we operate in a polarized environment. I have argued that we still have a unipolar system where the powerful, and particularly the Euro-North American centric civilization, if at all we can call them that, they have unhinged power in terms of information. So they control information and they control knowledge production. What is it that we can do in order to counter this narrative? Because you look at CNN, you look at BBC, you look at France 24, all these mass media platforms, they always speak in unison. And with us Africans, we do not have a platform where we speak about our issues in terms of multimedia. We do not have that. Gaddafi tried to initiate that, but of course we know it's part of why they killed him anyway. So part of it is also scholarship. What I normally do with students that I teach, I normally do this. I would actually award more marks for students that engage African scholars, because we have a lot of scholars that are of African origin and that are of African disposition who have proffered a lot of information on the very issues we are speaking about. But because academia and scholarship tends to silence these, they are banished into silence. And therefore, part of what I do would actually to award marks to students who do that. Oh, by the way, I also had a comment to say there are people who learned some new things in a gathering like this. So part of why these international conferences are convened is to disseminate information. And because this is an official gathering of the university, any conference is an official gathering of the university, and information that is shared there, it is regarded as information that has been synthesized and it's information that is credible. So use as much information as you can from what you have heard in the deliberations that were given, because it's official information and you can always quote these sources. I would like to end here and give others an opportunity to respond. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can Prof. Evgeny also respond? Prof? I'm not sure if Prof is struggling to hear me. Maya, I see your hand is up. You can just respond to the questions. Thank
Professor
you.
Gratikov. Professor.
Okay, shall I? I will try not to take too much of your time. First, I would just like to say that I'm so delighted to hear so many of my colleagues from African countries to know so much about my country, where it stands in terms of international relations and what principles it is guided by. When it comes to Russia's main interest in Africa, I would say that number one is diversifying its partners. You know, there are some of the honorable speakers who have already mentioned the fact that Russia and Africa, the 1990s was a lost decade, so to speak. So there was zero contact. And look where that brought us to, you know, at the end of 1990s, we can even probably say that, actually not the end, but by mid-90s, that was also a form of neo-colonialism in Russia, because we had foreign Western companies operating in Russia. Some of them even can you imagine that we had gas mining plants in the Russian Far East that were operated together with Western companies. So we actually had very little control of our own natural resources. We also had a lot of Western funds and NGOs that, under the pretext of being NGOs, were actually spreading some absolutely different agenda. So I would say, if that was not complete neocolonialism against Russia, it was at the very least an attempt at it. And now I think we have grown much wiser in understanding that we also need to build other ties with people and with nations who are like-minded. And when it comes to people, I mentioned that for a reason, because I think also one of the professors here said, had an idea about the fact that the AU, he said, does not represent the people of Africa. Now, the people are a key component, of course, in eradicating the false information, the misinformation between Russia and Africa. Now, of course, I think that first and foremost, conferences like this, like Dr. Niera has said, but also tuning into Russian media. We have Sputnik now in several dozen languages, including French and English, which are some of the languages that Africans also speak. We also have it available in Arabic. We also have RT, which is a news channel, and they have quite a number of articles and publications that have also been authored by some of researchers, some of the colleagues that I know. So it's not just journalism for the sake of sensationalism, you know, but that also the channel also provides certain information that comes from academia, from the intellectuals. So you can rely on that as a wonderful source. But also, of course, last but not the least, something that I have always used. For me to know Africa, I have two recipes. One is to have African friends in Russia. They tell me so much more about, they have such wonderful perspectives and such wonderful insights that I would never think about. And I think this is a call for all of us, for my compatriots, but also maybe for your esteemed audience to get to know Russians in person, to, you know, establish contact that will, a lot of the Russians, especially the ones who do not permanently live in other countries, but who have stayed in Russia for quite a while, and they will share very nice insights and perspectives with you as well, so you will understand the country better. And the other recipe is, of course, coming to Russia and seeing things through your own eyes. This is what I've been doing. I've been traveling to Africa for over 15 years now, and the things that I see, that I very rarely read them anywhere. So, you know, it takes, for the academia, it takes a while to process those things and to actually understand and provide conceptualization for how they actually work. But for us, things like the World Festival of Youth and Students that we recently had in Sochi, we had quite a number of African delegations, and people have been telling us that this has disrupted all of the misconceptions, all of the fake ideas that we had in our minds before, that, you know, people get killed in Russia, that we have xenophobia, extremism, etc., in the streets. So they can see by their own eyes, you know. In Kiswahili we have the saying, kusikia si kuona, we have the same in Russian. It's always better to see with your own eyes than to learn something from hearsay. I guess that's my point. Thank you.
Dear Shai, maybe I answer the question.
Yes, Prof.
I have only one question, is why are you referring to it as a special military operation instead of humanitarian crisis? And I should say that special military operation is the official name of the use of Russian force in Ukraine. Second, before our special military operation, for Ukrainian region declare independence from Ukraine. And then leaders of these four Ukrainian regions, independent regions, ask Russia to help military to help them on their way to independent status in international relations. So Russian leaders and especially President Putin made a decision to use force just to help these four regions of Ukraine, independent regions. Russia agree with this independent status of these four Ukraine regions. So we call it a special military operation, not one of humanitarian crisis. So it's maybe the differences of approaches to the conflict in Ukraine. For Russian people, for Russia, it's a special military operation, but maybe for Other countries, it's maybe humanitarian crisis. But nevertheless, we have such situations that four Ukrainian regions declare independence from Ukraine. And we should know this status of four Ukrainian regions. And it's very important to access if you, for example, want to make some analysis on the issue of Ukrainian crisis, you should know that we have now four independent regions, or we can call the independent states, and Russia. So it's the question, and now they are not independent states. According to our parliament, they were these four Ukrainian regions were enrolled in Russia Federation, and up to now it's our territory of Russia. So now we have some kind of military operation between Russia and Ukraine. So we should understand this rather complicated situation in this part of world politics. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Prof. Can we give everyone a round of applause for, the first session that we had?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Colleagues, we were supposed to have a short break now, but we are afraid that we don't want to disrupt, this session. Can we just continue? Those who want to go to the toilet, you can just excuse yourself and then come back, because we're having a lot of participants also online. So we just thought maybe we should just continue with the presentation of papers. Can I just check, is Mizet here? Mizet? Okay. So with session 2, we're going to start with Mizet Ramesh, who is a research fellow at the Center for Applied Analysis of Global Transformations, and the presenter will be talking about Russia's approach to global governance in cyberspace. Mizet?
Okay, good afternoon, dear colleagues. And first of all, I want to discuss the problem of cyber governance, but I've heard a lot of reports about financial and economic situation and economic cooperation, Russia and African states economic cooperation. So I want to share a little bit another topic about cooperation in financial and economic sphere, and also in technological sphere. It is a part of global governance, because Russia and BRICS states are now promoting new system of global governance, and this new system covers not only world politics, political aspects, but also covers economic, financial, technical, and cyberspace. And our contemporary international relations system was formed after the Second World War by the United States and Western states, and they established new organizations, World Bank and International Monetary Fund, and they are also providing and promoting multi-stakeholder approach for global governance, as well as in cyberspace and in economic governance. So Russia suggested new approach, multilateral approach, to integrate cyber security, technological security, economic security in multilateral organizations and give developing countries an opportunity to vote on issues covers global governance in global scale and regional scale. Now we have different organizations. We have United Nations, and United Nations has Telecommunication Union, which is a part of United Nations. But the United States and European Union suggested a new working group on cyber governance. And they suggested to include private companies like Microsoft, Meta, and other big tech companies to global governance and cyberspace. But for developing countries is a real threat to the national security because they don't have their own multinational IT companies, and they should follow rules established by companies who have monopoly on some spheres, like Amazon has a monopoly on cloud technologies, Facebook has monopoly on social networks, and others. So Russia and China suggested to include only national states to the system of global governance in cyberspace, and suggested new resolution to the United Nations, and majority of United Nations members agreed to make this only state-focused format. So why I want to start speak about financial and economic system, because developing countries are dependent from Western financial institutions and Western economic institutions. We have SWIFT, and sanctions against Russia showed that we could face problems when we have disputes with Western states and European Union. And we have the same situation in the cyberspace. The only company to register new IP addresses is American private company. So how it is possible to all countries in the world register their IP addresses in one American private company? So the suggestion of Russia and China and other BRICS states is to give this right to United Nations and United Nations Telecommunication Union to make this process more transparent and let developing countries to defend their own national interests. Then we have a dependency on technological sphere and so-called technological gap between developing countries and developed countries, because United States and European Union refused to transfer technologies, for example, high-speed chips and microprocessors to developing countries such as Russia, China, and they want to produce such microprocessors only in friendly countries, democratic countries. So according to them, you should be a liberal democracy to buy their technologies. And Russia, China, and other BRICS states are also promoting the independent system, like technological decoupling, to transfer technologies to developing countries and promote their own industrial capabilities to produce their own microprocessors, their own technological facilities, and then to develop their own applications. China's chairman Xi Jinping announced that the national priority is to develop artificial intelligence technologies, space technologies, and quantum technologies. So, as well as the Russian president also mentions that artificial intelligence technologies are the priority of Russian science and industrial complex. So we should give developing countries an opportunity to participate in international developing international research groups, develop our own system, and cut dependent ties with Western countries and European United States and European Union, and produce our own microprocessors, our own applications, and in such way we can defend our national security, our national cyber system, and our our countries will be more stable in terms of technological development. So if we are talking about some real cases, BRICS countries now is using their own rules, in cyberspace, and after the extension, new BRICS members will join this system and respect internet sovereignty, internet independence, and Russia is like a locomotive in the United Nations to promote new international cooperation formats in cyber and in information space. So thank you for your attention, and maybe there are some questions.
Thank you very much, Mizet. Let's give him a round of applause. I'm informed that Dr. Mthembu is here in the venue with us. Can I check with you, Doc? Can you come and present? Yes. Okay, so Dr. Mthembu is attached to the Institute for Global Dialogue, and he'll be presenting a paper on Africa-Russia relations in the changing geopolitical landscapes. Let's give him a round of applause.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you for the invitation. We actually flew in this morning and then had to fly back to Johannesburg because of weather. But it's good to be part of this conference, and I think there's a few, sort of points that I'll, sort of make. Try not to keep it too lengthy. Essentially, what I'm going to put out is a few areas, I think, which are going to be important not only for us who are researching, this topic, but areas that have become quite important also for policymakers when it comes to navigating an increasingly fractious international geopolitical landscape. And some of the input, I guess, is reflections from the Russia-Africa Summit, which took place last year. Some of us were in attendance of that in St. Petersburg. And what is quite clear is that countries like South Africa, but also countries on the African continent, have come under enormous pressure in the last few years to basically take a particular position, whether it is pro-Russia or whether it is anti-Russia. I think what has been quite interesting is that most African countries have tried to navigate this fractious international landscape by essentially taking a position of non-alignment on this. They have basically calculated that it is not in their interests, in the immediate and short-term and even long-term interests, to essentially form part of any particular power bloc in the world, whether that power bloc is led, by the United States, or whether that power bloc is led by China, whether it is led by Russia. essentially what African countries have been saying is that they are prepared to work with all major powers to essentially advance their own development interests. And we've seen that in recent years. So if if you're based in Pretoria or Johannesburg, working for a foreign policy think tank or working in government, what you would have noticed is that in the last 2-3 years, there's been quite a number of delegations coming to South Africa to try and understand South Africa's position, on the war in Ukraine, to try and understand South Africa's voting patterns in the UN General Assembly. And these delegations have come from various countries, from Germany, from France, they've come from, Congress people in the United States. Many of you would have seen that the US Congress at some point was threatening South Africa's benefits within the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. And in all of that, South Africa has basically stood its ground. Now, we may critique at times the way in which, South Africa has communicated its message from time to time, whether there's been a consistency or an inconsistency. But ultimately, the country has basically stood its ground, because the argument has been that what is happening in Europe, South Africa was not involved in that. African countries were also not involved in the roots of that. And many of you would have seen that, in fact, African countries have, instead of sort of just sitting on the fence, they have also been actively engaging European countries, they've been engaging the US, they've been engaging Russia, even engaging Ukraine on some of the consequences that they see of the ongoing tensions within Europe. And of course, we've been affected in terms of energy prices, we've been affected in terms of supply chains, in terms of food inflation. So a number of areas have affected us. But I think one of the things that have become quite clear in terms of the official positions coming out of most African countries is that they do not see it as in their interests to basically be on any particular side. So at the Russia-Africa Summit that was held in July 2023, you essentially had representatives from 49 African countries. They all descended on St. Petersburg. And what were they discussing? They were discussing and concluding agreements on a range of areas, from economy, politics, security, and advancing humanitarian cooperation. What's important is that this meeting came obviously in an environment fraught with geopolitical tensions and ongoing pressure on Africa by the United States and its European allies to choose sides in the conflict in Ukraine. And one of the things I think that were also then important in that Russia-Africa summit, so I just mentioned, the impact of the rising costs of food imports in Africa, caused by a number of consequences, amongst them obviously the unilateral sanctions that have been placed on Russia, challenges to the supply chains, that we then feel the prices of. But basically what was interesting is that in the opening plenary of the summit, President Putin sought to present an alternative to the Black Sea grain deal, stating that Russia is responsible for the export of 20% of grains globally and ready to expand on these supplies to Africa through both commercial means, but also through non-commercial means. So commercial means obviously through regular trade, but of course for Russia to expand its exports of grains and other goods into Africa, Russia has had to look at some of its supply chains and reorganizing some of its supply chains, because the sanctions that have been placed on Russia have also impacted, of course, the insurance industry. So it obviously has an impact on the ability to get the goods, you know, to the market. And so Russia has been reorganizing itself when it comes to logistics, when it comes to its trading, and when it comes to also its insurance industry. And to a certain extent, I mean, you know, if you look at the Russian economy, it's remained relatively resilient. So, you know, many of you would have read reports in 2022, you know, that the Russian economy was on the verge of collapse because of these unprecedented sanctions that had been placed. But they were able to reorganize the economy in such a way that they have so far been able to absorb, you know, much of that pressure that is coming, you know, from that external pressure. And in 2023, there was an announcement that 6 countries from Africa would receive 25,000 to 50,000 tons of grain. And this was on a grant basis, so this was essentially free. And some of these countries included countries like Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, and the Central African Republic, and also Eritrea. And this was partly to basically deal with the expectations. At the time, it was known that the Black Sea grain deal was already going to be winding down. There were a number of challenges to the grain deal, and Russia had also outlined some of its grievances, which included that much of that grain that was, you know, meant to go to developing countries was actually finding its way into European ports and not making it to developing countries. So essentially, that grain deal was scrapped. And despite the challenges that were brought on by sanctions, it's also notable that the relationship between Russia and Africa saw an 18 billion trade turnover in 2022, with the aim of increasing this to 60 billion by 2026. So there's a target already that between Russia and Africa, by 2026, which is not far away, but it will be in time for the next Russia-Africa summit, that trade should basically reach 60 billion. And it's notable that the trade turnover between Russia and Africa had increased by close to 35% in the first half of 2023. Now, this is happening in the midst of geopolitical tensions. It's happening in the midst of unprecedented sanctions on Russia. So it's quite notable that despite all of those challenges, you've actually seen an upward trend. But the challenge now will be to how to sustain that upward trajectory. Remember that African priorities at the moment, because of much of the development backlogs on the continent, African countries are not interested in being caught up in the geopolitical tensions of the major powers. So whether it is tensions between the US and China, whether it is tensions between the US and Russia, African countries are basically saying, our priorities do not allow us to be caught up in the geopolitical tensions of the great powers. Our interests at the moment are developmental. Our interests are, we have a young population, 70% of Africans are under the age of 30, close to 70%, under the age of 30. Can you imagine that? You know, some of us here are basically old in Africa's demographics. You know, so in a continent like that, the continent has to create jobs for young people. It has to invest in the creation of regional value chains. And it cannot do that sufficiently in an international landscape where it is being forced to side with one power over the other. Instead, to meet Africa's development objectives, what Africans are saying is that they are open to engaging all stakeholders. And when conflicts are involved, like we've seen in Ukraine, what Africans have been saying is that we will not choose sides. Instead, we will speak with all stakeholders to try to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict, to try and address what are some of the root causes of that conflict. And so this is what African countries have been positioning themselves on. To just sort of, you know, close off, I think, with some key areas moving forward, how can, you know, Russia and Africa sustain, you know, this trade relationship moving forward? It's going to have to address the challenge of payment systems. The challenge of payment systems remains a challenge. If any of you travel now to any country in Russia, and you take any of your bank cards, whether it's Standard Bank, FNB, Capitec, Netbank, you name it, you try to swipe on any machine, it won't work. Why? Because the country has been removed from the SWIFT payment system. So, you know, so to get by, obviously you take dollars, you take, you know, euros, and you'll change them when you get there, change them into rubles. So a big task in order to meet those targets when it comes to trade and investment will have to be to find alternative payment systems so that Africans and Russians can transact and continue to transact through electronic means, through the use of digital currencies. And so there needs to be innovations. And this is going to be a big issue on the agenda as Russia chairs the BRICS summit this year. So there's a lot of research that's going into alternative payment systems. But also there's commitments into making payments in local currencies to facilitate trade. Already now, Russia and China, in the trade that they are doing, most of that trade is not in dollars. Most of it, you know, over 80%, 90% of that trade is in local currencies. It's no longer utilizing the US dollar as an intermediary. And so we'll have to find ways, and this has become an important issue not only for Africa, not only for Russia, but for many countries in the global south. Because think about it, if you borrow money in US, if you borrow money in US dollars, by the time you have to repay that money, there's certain things that are out of your control, like the exchange rate between the rand and the dollar. If the exchange rate is not in your favor, you paying back way more than what you actually borrowed. And so the movement towards the use of local currencies is gaining momentum, and will also have to gain momentum when it comes to Russia's relations with Africa. Lastly, Russia is an agricultural power. Many of us know it as a military power, a nuclear power, but Russia is also an agricultural power. I mentioned earlier that 20% of grains exported into the world coming from Russia. But in the relationship between Russia and Africa, it's going to be important that Africa is not only buying grain from Russia, but that African countries are working with Russian stakeholders in order to increase Africa's own agricultural yields, so that Africa is able to actually produce more of the food that it eats, but also so that it has sufficient food to also export. And Russia, being an agricultural power, will provide opportunities for Africa to work with Russia. Russia is also into mining, and there's opportunities. If you think about, for instance, the mining of potash, which is very important in terms of making fertilizers. So it makes an impact in terms of the input costs of farmers. At the moment, Africans are importing, fertilizers, a lot of them. And because of the tensions we've seen geopolitically, the prices for fertilizers have gone up, which reduces the profit margins of African farmers and makes it much more expensive to farm. So working with Russia, you can actually, in the mining industry, you can mine potash, increase its production and increase its input into African fertilizers. And in all of that, I think it's going to be important to look at how you can actually create joint ventures on the continent, so that whether Africa is working with Russia, China, or other international actors, that it is able to build up its own capacity to produce and its own capacity to create regional value chains. So I think let me leave it there, colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mthembu. Can we give Dr. Mthembu a round of applause for the paper that he just presented? I'm informed that Prof. Twala won't be joining us. He's not feeling well. And I think maybe I should just take a bite on, the conversation that we just had in the second session. What Ms. Ed and Dr. Mthembu, presented, I think it's more of a spillover from, the conversation that we had earlier on, the question of misinformation, the question of Russia's economy, trade, and, even the upcoming Russia-Africa summit. But also of interest, I think, when Dr. Mthembu was speaking on, Russia as, this agricultural power. I even thought of, the previous discussant, Dr. Gugara, when he was speaking on the food crisis that we are experiencing in Africa. And also regarding also the SWIFT payment system. I think you'd agree with me that, currently, there are a lot of talks on de-dollarization, and this need to trade on using, local currency. I think it's something that, perhaps we should embrace as African states moving forward. Without wasting any time, colleagues, I think I'm going to take 4 hands for this session. We are not doing well on time. 4 questions. If you have any questions on, the second session, the papers that were presented by Ms. Zed and Dr. Mthembu. If you have any questions, kindly raise your hand. 4 hands. So I'm going to take new hands first. 1 hands, 2, 3. Okay. Oh, 4. Apologies, I didn't see that in that order.
Thank you. My name is Tamane Tsolo. My question is I dedicate this question to Dr. Mthembu. Since we have started this discourse here on the Russia and Africa relations, I realize most of the speakers have always spoke from the side of what is it that Africa can benefit from Russia, but they haven't yet spoke much of what is it that Russia can benefit from African countries. So I want to know, Doctor, if what is it that Africa has reciprocated to Russia historically from our history? And after this Russia and Ukraine war had started, what is it that Africa has offered Russia so far that makes Russia be interested in Africa? Thank you.
If
Okay, mine it's on rand manipulation. So do you think that the dollar rising will be helping South Africa or other African states such as Nigeria? Because as we can see, Nigeria produces a lot of oil where it can stabilize its currency to become a powerful currency. But where the US is, we know that whenever there is oil, where there is oil, that's where it comes with full force. So do you think that the dollar rising will be a good option for South Africa?
Hello, my name is Zanetemba Sibi. May I please ask, as a young African with high interest in global politics, how do I now navigate the political landscape with it having so many different ideologies and negative narratives about what is being pushed in terms of the Russian and African relations? How do I see through all of that and become a better scholar in politics? And are there any available opportunities for an African scholar that is interested in becoming a Russian scholar?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Moses Musima, one of the UL students in political studies. My question was closely regarded with that one of, since while we have been in support by Russia since then till today, what is it that makes Russia in dialogues, like Dr. Mtembu is here with us, what is it in dialogues that Africa actually makes Russia to be that interested in us if it's not for what we have? I'm talking of minerals, everything that is coming from our African continent. Thank you.
I think we took all the hands. Dr. Mtembu, you can come this side just to respond to the questions.
Thank you. So a very good set of questions, if I might say. They say there's no bad questions, and that is very true. But definitely there are good questions. I think let me start with, I'll combine the first one with the last one because they're relatively similar. And it's a good point. I mean, what can or has Russia benefited, from Africa? Why is Russia interested, in Africa? Well, I mean, there's obviously, many of us are familiar with the historical relationship between, and I know in the earlier sessions you would have even gone into the relationship between the Soviet Union and Africa, the role of the Soviet Union in the anti-colonial movement. So there's obviously people-to-people ties, that are there and that have existed between Russia and Africa. Still today, amongst the older generation in Russia, you still find many Africa experts, some of whom are fluent in various African languages, who under the system of the Soviet Union, under the education system, had to become Africa experts. Some mastered languages like Swahili, some mastered languages like Amharic, and so you have obviously the people to people, the cultural ties that are there, and I think these are still important in terms of supplementing some of the state-to-state relations, right? You also have, think about it. So let's think what's happening at a strategic level. Some of the countries in West Africa that have experienced, you know, various changes of government, some, you know, unconstitutional changes of government, new military governments in Western Africa, who have at times kicked out the French for various reasons, right? Who have said, we've had this relationship with the French for many, many years. We don't see how we are benefiting from it. And that is largely driven by people that fit your demographic, young people who have actually been questioning the relationship between their countries and their former colonizers. Now, those countries have resources. They have mining resources, you know. So you had Western companies that have been operating there, extracting mineral resources there, but obviously the local populations asking themselves, are we benefiting? Now, if they get removed, that also creates opportunities. It creates opportunities also for Russian mining operations, you know. So you had mentioned in minerals, obviously. Now, this is not restricted to Russia per se. I mean, most actors who are coming into Africa understand that there are minerals, that there are new oil and gas discoveries, new exploration opportunities, that creates an attraction. But also remember that this is a continent that is essentially by 2050 would have doubled its population. So by 2050, we're going to have over 2 billion Africans. We have a rising African middle class. It may not be the most resilient middle class, but it's a relatively fast-growing middle class. Many of you will finish your education and join, you know, that middle class. That creates massive opportunities for external companies who are looking at new markets to grow their businesses, to grow their goods and their services. Africa is also integrating its markets. We're creating a single market. Rather than having 54, 55 individual markets operating on their own, we are integrating the continent and creating a single market, which creates opportunities not only for Africans, but it also creates opportunities for external companies who, if a Russian company sets up in South Africa, in the future, it no longer only has access to the South African market, it has access to the whole region of Southern Africa, about 400 plus million, you know, consumers, and even beyond that. So Africa is a region of opportunity. It is partly why it is not only Russia that's interested in Africa, but if, you know, you have a China-Africa Forum Summit, you have an India-Africa Summit, you have a Japan-Africa Summit, you have an EU-Africa Summit, you have a Russia-Africa, you know, Summit, or you have a Turkey-Africa Summit. All these countries are looking at this continent as an opportunity for growth, massive investment in infrastructure. So the development deficits that we see create opportunities for external companies. We also are a continent with enormous amount of unused arable land. So we are potentially an agricultural power, global power. You know, most of the world's unused arable land is in Africa, and that creates massive opportunities. So if you think, and if you, even if you're a power producing company, you know, based in Russia, based in other parts of the world, you are looking at a continent that is growing rapidly. What does this continent need? It needs education, it needs power, it needs roads, it needs housing, it needs services. All of these things create opportunity for external companies. At a political level, Africa is the largest voting bloc in the United Nations General Assembly. So if Africans coordinate their positions in the UN General Assembly, we are essentially the most powerful voting bloc in the UN General Assembly. Now, why are we important here? Because is the US, the Europeans, and others courting us when it comes to the UN General Assembly? They understand very well that all the various resolutions that are making their way into the UN General Assembly, it's very important how Africans vote, because it can influence the direction and the support levels for those resolutions. That's important for Western countries, but it's also important for Russia. As Russia makes its case, to the world, why it has embarked on what it refers to as a special military operation. It's important to explain its position to African countries so that even if African countries don't necessarily support Russia, but they don't also oppose Russia, they perhaps take a position of non-alignment. And that also works in Russia's political interests. And then, I've listed quite a few areas, which sort of point out why, that Africa is not just a passive player when it comes to the geopolitical game. We are contributing, to the world's interests, to global growth, and to a number of opportunities that international companies witness. And the fact that Russia was not as involved in Africa just after the fall of the Soviet Union means there's a lot of potential growth in the relationship, economically, culturally, socially, for Russia to exploit in Africa. But we turn that around also. Russia is a huge country. There's also opportunity for South Africa and for African traders to find opportunity. There's a lady up there, a young lady, who asked about opportunities to become a Russia expert. There's a growing group of African students studying in Russia. It has a fairly advanced higher education system, Russia. Some of it a legacy of the Soviet Union, with modern innovations and all of that. So there's massive opportunity for students from South Africa to actually find scholarships and actually go and study in Russia. So those things are actually going to expand going forward, because Russia has an interest in expanding its relations in Africa, and Africans are also looking at more opportunities to go and study abroad. So those interests will converge. And I mean, if you can, so if you do your studies, I mean, firstly, you don't have to wait to be in Russia, to be, let's say, an expert, to increase your knowledge on Russian and on Russia's role in the world. So if you're already beginning now, and then you go into sort of post-grad, and you find, study opportunities in Russia, you could basically take those forward and even pick up, the language. And you become an asset, not only for South Africa to advance its relations with Russia, but you also become quite an asset for Russia to close bridges and to create bridges between Russia and Africa. So there's a lot of opportunity, and not only in research, but also in the private sector. There's private sector companies from Russia looking to invest in Africa, looking at young experts in Africa that understand, Russia. So there's a lot of opportunities for African scholars to become Russia experts. In fact, that's something that we would very much encourage in a changing international landscape, in a landscape that is increasingly fragmented. It's important to understand the great powers, and Russia is one of those great powers, And then lastly, I think it was about how to navigate sort of the political landscape with competing narratives. which was linked also there. I think, you know, we are seeing even in today's conversations that at times we do need to understand that information at times is not always detached from a particular political narrative or a political agenda, right? So you know, immediately after 2022, as somebody said earlier, we saw many narratives around, you know, the weakness of the Russian army, that they would not, you know, be good, that we saw how, you know, narratives around how the Russian economy will basically plummet, but we're seeing that some of those narratives are adjusting now to the reality. So when we consume information, we always have to ask ourselves, we always have to be skeptical. We are scholars, by the way. You know, all of us, we are scholars, so there is a certain degree of skepticism, a healthy skepticism, you know, that we adopt in navigating competing narratives, so that we understand where these narratives are coming from, what is the source of these narratives, what is the objective, how are they trying to influence your own thinking, so that you are in a position to make up your own mind, you know. But I think in order to do that, what becomes important is to understand your own interests, especially when it comes to, if you have to one day advise, you know, people in any foreign ministry. It's important for any country to understand what are their interests. If you don't understand your interests, you are easily swayed. Today you support this initiative in the General Assembly, tomorrow you support that initiative, and you're like a tree without its roots, so you just sway from one side to the other. But if you understand your interests, then you also understand how to navigate competing, let's say, information landscape that will advance your, you know, particular interest. So at times information, yes, is not always detached from a particular political narrative. But if you know what your interests are, then I think you are sorted. And then last one, which I almost forgot, de-dollarization. De-dollarization, I think, is a trend that is being catalyzed by the US itself. So the US, by adopting these unprecedented sanctions on Russia, confiscating its you know, foreign assets, you know, even talking today about whether it might use some of those foreign assets that are confiscated to actually fund, you know, Ukraine. What does that do? Think about it. If you are, you don't have to be Russia. You could be country A or country B that is observing that. And what you are saying is that, okay, so if I take positions that are seen by the US as working against their interests, the US has the ability to weaponize the US dollar, to basically seize your assets, use them in any way they want to. What does that do? It erodes international norms, especially in the international financial architecture. And it makes other countries to think we need to diversify how we are actually utilizing and storing our financial assets. You know, and so this is what we are seeing. So the trend towards de-dollarization, I think, is something that's going to happen. It accompanies an increasingly multipolar world order. So the world is becoming multipolar politically, but it is also becoming multipolar in the economic side. And it is in South Africa's interest, but I don't think South Africa will move too quickly, because South Africa still has assets, quite a number of assets in dollars. So it will be more of a gradual process for South Africa, rather than sort of an overnight switch. What South Africa will try to do is to diversify, you know, its assets in a direction of de-dollarization, and I think this is something that many other countries are also looking at. Yeah, let me stop.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mthembu. Can I just check with Mizet if there are any questions, comments that you'd like to make? Mizet, is Mizet still in the session?
Good afternoon, Judy. I think he had to run for some errand. He has been called for a quick meeting.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Claire. Can we then have closing remarks by Prof. Aduyao Nikes from
Yeah.
the center? Yes.
Good morning, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank our partners from South Africa and say that the activities have been organized at a high level. That just to show or to say how, our South African universities, and particular African universities, also are, such kinds of competence to organize such kind of activities. I really appreciate it. I just even come also from South Africa this week, where I attended also a conference at West Cape Town, Cape University. Also, their activity was also really, good organized. So I really appreciate all these events that we are organizing together. So first of all, also I would like to really appreciate the speech of my previous speakers that have been mentioned today, very important topics. My contribution will be maybe a legal point of view. Despite some of them having already a little bit explained, but I will try to also give my own opinion on some issues. You know, what I'm remarking now, I can note now is that, and today it's been also explained by my previous speaker from our center, Professor Grashkov, concerning the nature itself of the ongoing military operation in Ukraine. And if you note everywhere, all over the world, how people are noting, that is the kind of Russian aggression, that as they used to call it. But I would like to mention that in international relations, unfortunately, there are some approaches sometimes, what we call double standards. Look, for example, the intervention of the USA in Afghanistan have never been mentioned as aggression. In Vietnam, have never been as an aggression. In many countries in Africa, even in Libya, have never been mentioned as an aggression. And also, I remember that in 1920s, for example, there have been also the intervention of France in Syria. We call it a humanitarian intervention. No one never mentioned that it's aggression, you know? So what does it mean? It means that unfortunately, the actors of international relations are using this topic or these terms depending on their own opinion, on their own interest. So coming back to what is going on in, for example, in Ukraine. Yeah, I got the chance, for example, to be in the region of Donbass during the, even in 1914, when the crisis started. You know, and from 1914 until the beginning of the special military operations, you know, there are reports of the UN, more than 9,000 persons, have been killed. 9,000, without talking about the infrastructure, destruction, and so on. No one, they didn't mention nothing about it. So how long can that could, continue? Of course, so there was a need, in particular it was even an obligation for Russia to intervene, to stop this kind of killing, massive killing of peoples, you know. So in this point of view, of course, we can talk about aggression in my own point of view. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, you know, people are choosing the topics depending on their own interests. Particularly talking about the actors of international relations. So that's what also we can call double standard. So coming to everything that has been said today, you know, Africa has its own interests, as well as Russia. So I hear, for example, about Russia is a more provider of weapons in Africa and so on. But we must know in the which context. And I remember the report of our colleagues from Zimbabwe who said that at that time Russia was the first supporter of the liberal movement in Zimbabwe by providing weapons. So you need to take into account all this context, you know, but not thinking in terms of point of view of business, not, but in terms of point of view of fighting for the liberation of the Africa. Yeah, me, for example, as a origin from West Africa, I know what I'm talking about. Today also the situation in Sahel, for example, in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have been mentioned, where the question of geopolitics is very real in this region. So in this point of view, of course, even yesterday, yeah, one of my articles that have been also published, where I mentioned that Russia is considered as a provider of security in the region. You know, during 10 years, the UN forces, more than 10,000 forces, were not able to, bring stability in the region and peace. And look, after withdrawing by this, last year, in December of last year, the forces, not only the UN forces, but also France forces, in 3 months, with support of Russian forces, Mali cover all the, the national, the integrated territorial integrity of its own territory with help of Russia. So that's what we need to understand, that the European, until we have on our soil, in African soil, yeah, the presence of foreign forces in terms of occupation, by maintaining military bases, yeah, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Mali, in Chad, and in Uganda, how do you call it, Djibouti, and so on. We will never, cover, security in these regions. So these countries are obliged to free themselves. A lot of things have been said today concerning the West African countries. I will not go to add something new, but in my conclusion, just to say that we need to analyze, we need to assess the situation in its general, approach, not by, separate points. So that is something very important. Let me say something. For those maybe dog doesn't know really what is Russia. Russia is the only country, even, not even you can see in the world, that have all natural resources for its own development. Maybe sometimes in my analysis, I used to say that maybe that was the great mistake that Russia has, because Russia doesn't need the other countries, African countries. Russia doesn't need to exploit African countries. Russia has everything that the country needs for its own development. So the Russian intervention in Africa could be only in humanitarian purpose. And we need to assess that in order to understand, in order to choose our partners also in the future. So thank you for your attention. I think that if you have any question more, of course, I will be able to answer. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Prof. Claire, can I just give you a minute just to do maybe just some closing remarks before we move to the last session? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, colleagues, especially Professor Shai, for all the support. I know soon I'm going to most likely see you and Professor Mthembu here in Moscow. I just wanted to comment on the lady who was asking about Russian experts. I think from this conference, I could see the evidence of me and Professor Adu. We are Africans, so I come from Kenya, and Professor Adu comes from Ivory Coast, but we've been able to live and work in Russia. So it's not only about just studies. Right now, you could be African experts can live and work in Russia. So thank you all for all the support. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much, colleagues. We are now moving to the last session. session 4, which is, closure. I'm going to request Dr. Tlowane to make announcements, followed by Prof. Sithole, the Director for School of Social Sciences, for the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm just going to make one announcement concerning how we're going to go about our refreshments. Why are you guys smiling? Wow. It's been a long day, ne? No, thank you for hanging in there. Okay, this is how we're gonna go about it. Please listen carefully so that we know what to do from here. To our postgraduates, which is our honors and master students who are here, arrangements have been made for you guys to join the guests and the staff. Yeah. Wow. Arrangements have been made for you guys to join our guests and staff members at Take 5, okay? So when we disperse here, please walk to Take 5. When we get there, remember we are the hosts, right? So when we get there, let's behave like hosts, all right? And give preference to our guests. But of course, we are also being catered for the very same way that our guests are being catered for. And then our undergraduates, please let's remain here. Your refreshments will be delivered in this venue, okay? I think that is clear. So to our guests, we will make sure that our staff members, those who do not have transport, those of us who have transport will try to accommodate each other so that it doesn't take very long for us to reach there. But of course, we, the young ones, I know, will be there in a second. All right, thank you very much. I'll hand over to Prof. Sithole to give the vote of thanks.
I see. Yes. All right. That makes it easier. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Tlowane. Dr. Tlowane. Thanks also to the program director. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to be making a long speech because I realize that there's an important item to be attended immediately hereafter. But let me observe protocol and thank the university management, and I'm here referring to Prof. Mokhalong for making it possible for this event to unfold as a date. Our thanks also go to the DVC Research, Innovation and Partnerships, Professor Singh for welcoming us. And I think we were well welcomed and we were able to engage with the subject of the conference. We were all relaxed. All the participants that are in this building and even those who are taking part online were able to engage meaningfully with the issue of the day. I would like in the same breath to express a word of gratitude and support from Dr. V.A. Dalinov, who is attached to the Center for Applied Analysis of Global Transformation. Also thank the DVC, our DVC Teaching and Learning Professor Madaji. I also want to express our gratitude to the deanery. I'm referring here particularly to the offices of the Executive Dean, Professor Mautu, as well as Prof. Rafapa. Thanks also to Dr. Luhodi for directing the program so ably. She did that and the program was steered to its conclusive end. I think you started well and we're ending very well. We appreciate that. Colleagues also worked behind the scene to get us to where we are now. And I'm referring here in particular to people who, were responsible for the logistics. Dr. Sklowani and Gluli, as well as Ms. Palani. I also wish to express our sincerest thanks and gratitude to the students who are the main beneficiaries of this particular conference. It couldn't have happened without your presence. And I want to believe that you learned a lot. You have in an international conference. May I just appeal that you don't tamper with this gadget. It disturbs the flow of communication. You have participated in an international conference, and surely you, in your curriculum vitae. And the success of the conference lies also heavily on the contribution made by our marketing division, the people from the media who are very good at what they're doing, and we want to thank them heartily. But I also want to express a special word of thanks to Professor Shai. I'm not sure how he handled the item on setting the tone for the conference, because probably it happened as I was waking my way to the hall. But I know his caliber, and I know that if he meant to set the tone of the conference, he really pitched the standard. But I also want to express my thanks, heartfelt thanks, for his networking ability, pulling the strings to make this conference a success. I know you have been doing that over the years, and our students have benefited very, very well from this kind of activities. The conference, needless to say, was quite didactic. It was exciting, it was thought-provoking, it was stimulating, mainly through the erudite presentations of scholarly papers. It is no mean feat to spend sleepless nights preparing an academic presentation. Experienced or not, one is bound to have some goosebumps, and one feels better at the end of the presentation. I think let's give a round of applause to our speakers. And I think we should also give a round of applause to those people that I have mentioned earlier on. The speakers have actually confirmed the adage that a school or a university or a lecture hall is nothing else but a building with tomorrow inside. We thank you collectively and individually for your effort. And I'm referring here to the speakers, Dr. Signere from the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, Dr. V.M. Nkuna, our alumnus, attached to the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, Prof. Evgeny Grachikov from the Center for Applied Analysis of Global Transformation, Dr. Mtembu from the Institute for Global Dialogue. I really enjoyed the presentation. The subject of Africa-Russia relations was simplified, and I think I'm ready to sit for the next test. Any test, at whatever level. I think I'll pass it with flying colors. Thanks very much for the team. Thanks for factorizing the problem. I said the problem, the complex problem of Africa-Russia relations was simplified, it was factorized, and we each have a position on which side of the spectrum we stand as far as that is concerned. And our thanks go to the conference speakers and the conference organizers. The papers in the third session of our conference were also ably delivered by Dr. Maxim Nicolin, Mizet Ramesh, and I could not see the other colleagues. But suffice to say, I want to thank each one of you. Even if I didn't mention you by name, even those people who are participating online, all of you who have made this conference the success that it was. Thank you very much, and enjoy your refreshments and enjoy the rest of the day. See you again next time.